If you've made it here today, you've found Demo Days on LinkedIn. Happy Diwali to those who celebrate, and happy Thursday to everyone else. Thanks for joining me today. Today, we're going to tackle the retro or retrospective meeting. Is it just for software development teams? How do you get the most out of one? And perhaps just as important, how do you keep this meeting from going off the rails? If you find this session useful and want more insight, please go to githubuniverse.com where we've got tons of fresh talks now available on demand. With that said, let's welcome back Cameron Stewart, Enterprise Solutions Engineer, to tell us more about getting the most out of retros. Cameron?
Thanks, AJ. Appreciate that warm welcome. And hello, everybody. Thanks for having me back. Excited to be here and to talk to you today about the importance of the retrospective and feedback loops that you can use on your team. So let's go ahead and dive right in. For those of you that I haven't met before, my name is Cameron Stewart. I'm a solutions engineer here at GitHub. I'm relatively new to the company. I've been on board for about 7 months now, but I've been a longtime user, and I like to say fangirl of the platform. I'm based in Denver, Colorado, but previous to GitHub, I wanted to mention I came from a software company that really practiced agile software delivery practices to the nth degree. They really dialed it up to 11, and so that's why I'm really passionate about retros, and I'm excited to talk to you about them today because I've been through a number of retros. I've seen some that have been run really, really well, some that have been run maybe not so well. And so it's all of that kind of feedback and lessons learned that I've gained over the years that I am here to share with you today. So let's jump right into it. So who's excited? We're going to talk about meetings. Just kidding, kind of. I promise this is going to be fun, but we are going to talk about the retrospective. But from henceforth, I shall refer to it as a retro. But what we're fundamentally talking about is a meeting. It is, a meeting that was typically used by software development teams, oftentimes practicing agile processes, not always. But agile software development is definitely where retros really hail from. But what I am here to really posit today is that everyone should do retrospectives, not just agile software teams. The company that I mentioned that I worked for previously, retros were conducted on the engineering teams, certainly after something like a release or a sprint, but they were also done on the marketing teams, on the design teams, on the sales and the revenue teams. And so that is really the culture that I'm here to kind of promote and to encourage you to foster in your organizations, because retros really are a fabulous tool that can help any team become more collaborative, build better trust, and share accountability. So what we're going to discuss today, we're going to talk about, why would you want to consider doing this? Why is this a practice that you might want to consider adopting on your team? The benefits of retros. For those of you who maybe haven't been through a retro, we'll kind of walk through what the process is and how to retro. Then we're going to talk about different prompts and formats. If this is a practice that you're going to adopt to do on some kind of regular cadence within your team, it's nice to have different prompts and formats that can encourage different kinds of creativity within people. So we'll talk about some of the formats that I've seen over the years. And, if there's some that you have experienced, I'd love to hear from you as well. And then finally, as we're all kind of seeing, and with so many things in our world today, things have moved to a more virtual format, which traditionally, was really challenging for retros because those were done, in person at a whiteboard. But there are tools out there to be successful with running retros virtually. And so I have a really awesome open source tool that I want to kind of walk you through and demo, and it might be a good fit for you and your team. So that's the menu. That's what we're going to discuss. And without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so talking about, why is this, what are the benefits? Why would you want to consider doing this on your team? Well, in 2015, Google conducted a study to really find out what makes teams effective and productive. And what they were really looking for was, what are the traits of kind of certain individuals. What is that magic concoction? That's what, Google, they released, a report after their study, and they admitted to saying this, that, throughout their process, they were, confident that they were going to find the perfect mix of individual traits to build a really stellar team. There was a quote that I actually have here. It's like, take one Rhodes Scholar, two extroverts, one engineer who rocks at Angular, and a PhD. Voila, dream team. And they thought they were gonna find this winning concoction and combination, and they were dead wrong. And over 2 years, they conducted over 200 interviews with Google employees and looked at over 250 different attributes on 180 active Google teams. But what they found is that it's not those traits, it's not who on the team that matters, but it's really how that team functions and the structure of that team that really builds team effectiveness and good collaboration and productivity. And so this is kind of a summary of those 5 findings from their summary, but the most important one that I really want to zero in on today, because it's really at the core ethos of why we retro, is psychological safety. And psychological safety really aligns to the agile approach overall, that fail fast and learn. And it's all about feedback loops. You want to, in order to kind of foster that spirit of fail fast, you have to not be afraid to be vulnerable and to make mistakes and learn from them. And as humans, we know that that's so hard to do, so hard to admit that was a mistake. But one of my favorite quotes is, a mistake does not mean failure. Making it over and over again does. So this is, retros really kind of encourage you, don't be afraid of mistakes. Let's talk about, the things that we learned in whatever we're retroing. Again, it could be an event or a sprint or a release. Where are the areas for improvement? What can we learn from to move forward? And it really is kind of taking just the shame away from things that maybe we categorize as mistakes or errors, and really reclassifying them towards learnings and things that you could learn, that you could move towards improvement in the future. So if we kind of take, psychological safety really being at the core of the ethos and the retrospective, really we want people to be comfortable admitting mistakes so that we can learn from them, and so that everyone, feels comfortable sharing their ideas openly, and that then ultimately what that will feed and foster is better innovation and decision making overall, because the fear of making mistakes is what absolutely crushes creativity. And it's impossible to do creative and risky things if you can't be vulnerable and open. And what was found in that Google study, and I would think that we've all kind of come to learn this collectively, is that great teams are really ones that communicate with each other. They're ones that consistently make small course corrections and try different experiments. They trust each other and they encourage each other, and ultimately they share in the highs and the lows. They share in the accountability of things that were successes and things that were failures, and they share in those things equally. So retros are really a great tool to help you work towards fostering that kind of culture and environment on your team. So that was really kind of just a quick overview of why you would want to retro, all of the benefits of creating more creativity and collaboration, which we know leads to more rapid innovation, especially on software development teams. So now let's chat about how to retro. So the step number one is that you need to kind of get all of the logistics in place. You need to gather the folks. I'm going to kind of talk through an in-person retro first, because as I mentioned, we'll talk through running a retro in a virtual environment in just a bit. And so you want to gather the immediate team. And the immediate team here is something that I think is an important distinction. You really want to foster an environment where people feel safe to share both the good things and the bad. And so you might want to avoid having the crowd be too big. This is really, you don't want to encourage people to come that might prohibit that kind of environment or climate. So, if there's, high up leaders or even stakeholders, maybe just kind of a weekly team retro isn't the best idea to invite those folks to it. Setting the mood is actually really important with retro. It's an important distinction to kind of get people in the frame of mind that they're open and ready to kind of chat about some things and to go maybe, into some topics that are a little uncomfortable. And so it's important to really cultivate the mindset from, normal work mode into retro mode so that people are feeling in that mood, like I said, to just share and be open and be vulnerable. And so, oftentimes I definitely recommend, I think running retros on a regular cadence makes a lot of sense. For some teams, that might be on a weekly cadence. Maybe it's, longer cadences for other teams. But if it is something like a weekly cadence, what I've seen work really successfully is for it to be like the last thing on a Friday, for instance. And so, given if it is kind of in that time slot, maybe there's an opportunity to bring in snacks or beverages, alcoholic or non, depending on your preferences or organization culture. But even putting on music as people are kind of gathering, coming into the room, just kind of setting a tone for this is different. Even though yes, we're still at work and working, this is kind of a different space. So I think it's important to set the mood, like I said. You're going to discuss what the prompt and the format is. Like I said, there's all kinds of variations that exist out there. So it's important for people to kind of understand the prompt and the format. Like I said, we'll discuss a couple of different ones later on. And then set the house rules. And house rules, I'm going to put up a screenshot here. IDEO has a great list of kind of brainstorming house rules, but it's important to kind of set these and also get people to agree on them. This again kind of is part of cultivating that it's a different kind of mindset and to get people into just the right headspace. And so agreeing that, there's no judgment, this is really a safe space to discuss all kinds of topics and to encourage kind of harebrained or crazy ideas, to stay focused on the topic, to have, to really limit and mitigate not having side conversations to keep everyone focused, et cetera, et cetera. So these are some really great rules of brainstorming. Feel free to borrow these for your own teams. But again, it's important just to kind of set the stage. We're here. This is what we're trying to accomplish. Get people in the mood. From there, it's really kind of you can set up your retro stage, so to speak. And so again, this is done as at a whiteboard. This is a very common retro prompt. It's just happy, meh, sad, denoted with 3 emojis in the middle of a whiteboard. You kind of make the designated areas for each. And put that up, on a whiteboard, or if you're using kind of big post-it sticky papers on a wall, you can kind of be creative with the physical space that you have available to you. But fundamentally, you want to create 3 zones to capture the feedback that corresponds to those 3 zones. From there, you should typically do silent generation for 5 to 10 minutes. And so this is usually leveraged with, a bunch of different stickies and Sharpies. So it's, 1 Sharpie per person. And why I really like using Sharpies and Post-it notes is that it really encourages people to be concise, because, you don't want to give people too much room to necessarily really go to town writing an essay on what didn't work well about that last release. It really forces them to be focused with the topic or the point that they're trying to make. So by limiting them to use a Sharpie and a Post-it, it really kind of like physically constrains how much they can share. And so it forces them to be concise. Now, you can also, if you are working on a whiteboard or something that you can kind of write on that erases, you could also just have, give people markers and they can go up and they can write under the various columns. You don't necessarily have to follow the sticky Sharpie model. It's just something that I've seen done most commonly. And so then after, oh, the other thing that I wanted to just mention about silent generation, because I had an asterisk with the amount of time, I recommended 5 to 10 minutes. This will vary greatly depending on the size of your group. So if you're just doing kind of your immediate team on a weekly cadence, 5 to 10 minutes is, usually enough to give people the time to write down what they want to say. If you're doing something like a OKR review at the end of a quarter with a slightly bigger team, if they might need a little more time. So, you want to adjust the silent generation. A great kind of pro tip as a facilitator is to check in with your folks. Say, how How's everyone doing? Are people slowing down? Do we need, 2 more minutes, 1 more minute, etc. So you can really just kind of adjust the slide based on the size of the group. After silent generation, then you encourage people to go up and put their stickies where they correspond with the corresponding column where they belong. And as a facilitator, this is really another kind of good move as a facilitator is to, as stickies are starting to go up to the board, to start to read them and see if you can identify any themes or general groupings or trends, because sometimes it makes sense to really group stickies together and to talk about those in a thematic way, if you will. So, kind of walking around and starting to read the feedback to see if you can pick up on some of those threads is a really good move. Again, going back to the thought that if it's a large group, sometimes it makes sense to actually physically group these stickies. And sometimes, and this is, I've seen it done both ways. I don't know that I have a strong opinion on either way. Sometimes you can just make kind of clusters or groups within a given column, within the happy column, for instance. But sometimes you can actually kind of make clusters or topics that, span the three different columns. So, for instance, if we were retroing an event like a conference, for instance, and there were all kinds of comments about the food at the conference. And in the plus column, maybe it was like, well, there were vegan options, like that was great. And the vegans were happy about that. But maybe there were also a bunch of like, meh, not so great, or negative comments about, the food was always late, there were no snacks, the food was cold. You could potentially put, a grouping to say, let's talk about all things food, even though we have comments from different columns. So there's two kind of different approaches to grouping. Again, it really depends on the amount of feedback that you're trying to get through. The other way, if you are having a large group retro where there is a lot to get through and to talk through, you can also have people, when they go up and put their stickies on the board, if they still have their Sharpie in hand, can put like a +1 on that sticky if they felt that that comment resonated or if they agree with it. And so, stickies that have, multiple votes on it, those are the ones that maybe you want to tackle first because lots of people agreed with that or found that topic, important to discuss. So from there, actually, I'm jumping ahead here. So from there, once you, again, as a facilitator, have kind of gone and identified different themes, it's time to discuss. And this is where the meat of the retro really gets into it. This is where the feedback really comes out. You want to go and you want to take the stickies and discuss each item one by one. And oftentimes you can encourage, because we're constraining them to just a post-it to share their thoughts. You can read the comments and say, whoever wrote this, if you want to give a little more detail or context or thoughts, you're welcome to share. And people may or may not participate in that, and that's okay. But then to really use that as a prompt to facilitate group discussion, to see how others thought about it. And from there, again, kind of discuss the feedback that comes up for these various items that people brought up. As a facilitator, it's a good idea to, listen as people are discussing if action items come up, to start a parking lot of action items and to write those down. We'll talk about that in the next section, the do's and don'ts, how important it is to capture action items and then to act on feedback or act on the items, because the whole purpose of this feedback exercise is to take these learnings, to make slight adjustments, and to move in the direction of improvement. So you really want to, find those items that are kind of surfacing themselves from the group discussion and capture them so that you can actually act on them after the fact. So after stickies are up on the board, you discuss as a group. Like I said, it's important to really kind of go through them one by one. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the do's and don'ts. Capture an ongoing list of running action items as you go. Also, can be helpful to take a picture of the board and the stickies or the action items. That can be a really helpful thing to take back to your desk if you're going to capture these in another tool, or just to help you remind you of some of the feedback that was surfaced, so you don't have to go back to your desk. I certainly have done this before where I have like an armful of stickies and I have to remember where they all went. So use your iPhones and just take a picture of the whiteboard. It can make it a lot easier. So let's talk about common kind of pitfalls or do's and don'ts, also known as pro tips and pet peeves. So for the do's, I think that rotating facilitators is really, really key. This is my number one kind of pro tip, the one that I love and hold near and dear to my heart, and I highly, highly recommend it. Rotating facilitation across everyone in the group can be a really, really good idea. I had seen this done on a team, and then I had recommended that approach to another team that I was trying to encourage to do retros, and it really was a great approach because it gives other folks that maybe don't always have as vocal of a voice, whether they're quieter folks or whatever it may be, it gives them a chance to speak up. And since they're running the meeting, they really have a chance to kind of emphasize the things that they think are important. And it also does a great job of just encouraging visibility across the team and giving everyone kind of this equal chance to run the meeting, and it gives people practice at facilitation. So that, I think, is a really, really great one, is to constantly don't have the same person be running your retros every time. Keep it different and keep it new. Rotate the facilitation. um, the second one, oh, like I said, encourage precipitation from everyone on the team. Another idea, and this one I have kind of mixed feelings on. I did kind of a poll of a lot of my colleagues from both GitHub and previous positions saying, like, what are some of the best things that you've seen working in retros? And this was one that came up that I have seen this work really well. I've also seen it work not so well. But that is to basically invite someone that's not directly part of that project, for instance, to be your facilitator. I think where this is successful is if that person is a strong facilitator. But the quote that I really loved from the colleague that suggested this is, there was something a lot about that tasty impartiality that was really good for the group. So I thought that that was a funny quip. But that is definitely one approach because it does kind of give a neutral outside objective opinion. So that can be one suggestion as well. I mentioned this earlier. It's important to talk about every item. And the reason that I say that is because if it was important enough for someone to really put pen to paper and to put it on the board, then it's important enough to talk about. And so a great retro is really one where everyone's voices are heard equally. Don't forget that this is fundamentally a tool that builds trust on your team so that people feel comfortable to be vulnerable and ultimately be creative and take risks. And it really begins with building trust. So one way to make people not trust you is when they don't feel like they're being listened to. So it can be frustrating if you write something down on the board and it just doesn't even get acknowledged. So it's important to really acknowledge every item on the board, but sometimes grouping can help with that. If things are if you have a lot of feedback to get through, you can sometimes kind of summarize and ask if there are specific points that people wanted to call out. Um, there's a really great question that just came in through the chat about putting names on sticky notes. And I'm glad that you asked because I definitely should address that. These are anonymous. You really want it to be anonymous feedback. And in kind of the group discussion, that's where you ask for people to volunteer if they want to contribute more information. But this really is done kind of in the spirit of anonymity. And typically, people will say, yep, that was mine. This is kind of the background around it. And those are really positive things. If you're getting, a bunch of kind of snarky remarks in the negative column and people aren't willing to share who wrote that, that's an indication that there's not a lot of trust on your team. And so you should really start thinking about that and addressing that. So you don't explicitly ask for people to put their names on the stickies, but you can ask, who put this one up there? Do they want to share any more about it? And oftentimes people will volunteer. Um, I mentioned this. Capturing action items is super, super important because ultimately you're trying to move towards improvement. So you want to capture the things that you can actually work on. That's an important distinction. Capture the things that are actually feasible to work on, and then actually follow up on them. It's helpful after the fact of a retro to, capture all the items. And then as you're making progress, if something does get done, in next week retro, it's again, real pro move to be like, this is everything we captured last week. These were the action items coming out of last week. Here's the progress we made in this last, again, week or 2 weeks, whatever it is, to show people that you're actually genuine about making progress towards the feedback. So those were the do's. Let's talk about the don'ts. Um, Not listening. This is one of my biggest pet peeves, as you can see here. There's nothing worse than going to a feedback session where the person looking for feedback talks the whole time. And before you know it, the time is up and you've barely said a thing. That is a waste of everyone's time. Sometimes they are just trying to explain, why things were done a certain way. Honestly, it doesn't matter. If you're the one who is asking for feedback or who maybe will benefit the most from the feedback, you should really try to think about participating less. And what I mean, obviously, if there's good, healthy, organic discussion happening, jump in there. You don't want to limit yourself from that. But listening is going to be your best and most valuable move here. Because again, this is an open, safe space. People are sharing. Listen to what they're sharing. That's where you're really going to get the benefit, um, the most benefit out of the whole meeting, the retrospective. The other one, and this, we've kind of already talked about not following up on action items. You actually need to do the things that you say that you're going to do because it's just so important to team morale. Nothing kills just team overall morale or happiness quite like having just the same old issues come up over and over again and nothing being done to fix it. So if there are things that are coming up that can result in action items, make sure those aren't coming up in a recurring manner. You want to make sure that you're actually taking action on those things. A question just came in about how has the change from working from home versus an office setting for retros. I'm going to just curb that question for now because we have a section on how to do retros in a virtual setting, and I'll talk about kind of my experience in those environments. So just bear with me one few more moments. Again, I'm going to use this quote that I mentioned earlier. Again, it's one of my favorites. A mistake doesn't mean failure, but having kind of action items come up in a recurring manner is really important. Okay, so this is a really fun portion. We're going to talk about different prompts and formats. Like my some of my select favorites. If you have others that you've seen, I always am looking for good new retro prompts. So feel free to throw them in the chat. Like I said, I love hearing new formats and retro prompts. So the standard is really, like I said earlier, kind of the happy, meh, sad. Very easy to do on a whiteboard. It doesn't require a lot of artistic ability. Just throw some smiley faces, up on a whiteboard. And really, kind of what you're asking here is, what went well? What, did you find was a positive impact? If you're kind of thinking about like, meh, it's like, what could we have done better? What should we avoid repeating? And then in kind of the more negative column, it's, what could we improve? What should we avoid doing again in the future? This has a couple of different variations. This, I think, generally happy, meh, sad has largely, as far as I've seen kind of in the industries and recent feedback sessions I've been a part of, has transitioned to kind of happy, I'm wondering about, or I still have remaining questions about, and meh. Another good version of this is the good, the bad, and the ugly I saw recently. But those are all kind of the same variations of three different smileys. Generally, what went well, what could we improve on, what should we avoid doing in the what could we avoid doing in the future? I just got called out that I'm missing my actions item column. I'm just going to go ahead and say that I brought that up earlier, so it's not represented here, but absolutely on your whiteboard, there should be kind of an action items column. So thank you for keeping me honest. All right, so another prompt that I really like is start, stop, continue. So these are good prompts for things that are happening kind of on a regular cadence. So, sprints, events. I've actually seen this prompt used also in your one-on-ones or in a one-on-one that I have found very helpful. It's a great way for kind of one-on-one direct feedback with your manager and if you are an IC or with your IC, if you are a manager, and please borrow this prompt, I think it's a really great way for kind of an individual to contributor to go to their manager and say, hey, I thought it would be cool if we, switch it up and try a new format for this week's one-on-one. Or next week, could we try this format? It kind of helps you makes you look good to your boss, which we all love. But this one I think is really great. Start, stop, continue. What do you want that person or that team, or for the next time, what should we start doing? What is something that is not working for us anymore? It's no longer serving us. We should remove this from our processes. We should stop doing this. And what's something that's working well? What should we continue working on? The 4 L's is another one that I really, really love. And so this is liked, learned, lacked, and longed for. And I find this one to be particularly useful after something like a workshop or a training session where the objective is specifically learning. I have used this one a lot when I've run kind of training workshops previously. And I find it to be just a really, really great one. So it's pretty, says it in kind of the name. What did you like? What is something you learned? What was lacking, and then also what was something that you were maybe hoping you would see, but then never ultimately made it to the curriculum. So the 4 L's is another really great one. Moving right along, plus and delta. This is kind of a quick and dirty one. It's just a binary. Basically, what worked well? What did you like? What were the pluses? And what would you change to improve? So plus delta is another really great kind of fast feedback prompt. And then there are some artistic varietals, and I have to say these are they hold a special place in my heart because I just think that the first time I saw this done, it was really, really fun. So the first one is if you, want to draw to your best ability something that resembles a sailboat. You talk about kind of what is the lift, what has gone well, what helped us kind of put wind in our sails, what helped us really take off. And then if you think about kind of like the boat, what helped us kind of just stay the same, kept us even, just kept us steady, if you will. And then in terms of like the anchor, what really pulled us down, what really prevented us from going faster. Whether or not you use kind of the actual boat bottom, it could just be anchor and kind of wind or sails. That's another variation that I think works really well. Very similarly, you can think of a hot air balloon. So again, what was kind of the fuel that raised us up, the ballast, what was kind of things that pulled us down. And with both of these, you actually encourage people to put the stickies in the actual directions of, what lifted us up, put it, by the balloon and in the air, and what kind of did you feel brought us down, put it with, the ballast or the anchor. And then one kind of final one, similar, you can think of a rose, what was really beautiful and smelled good, and what were kind of the thorny areas of the sprints. So there's really lots of room to get creative with retro prompts. I myself am not an artistic sort, if you can't tell by my slides. So I usually just stick with smiley faces. But these ones I have seen are always really impressive. And I think really the point is that you want to, whether, it doesn't really matter the format that you're doing, whether you're doing the smiley faces or the 4 L's, the good, the bad, the ugly, start, stop, continue. The important point is that it's important to switch it up because sometimes different things strike different creative chords within different people. And also, if you are doing this on a regular cadence, kind of doing the same old, process can just get monotonous and old, and you can start to just lose engagement from people. So it's always kind of fun to introduce a new retro prompt. Again, the artistic ones are just a really fun way to get people engaged and just to do something different to shake it up. So again, which one of these would you think resonates the most with you, or kind of stirs some creative juices for you? And what are some that are missing? Like I said, I'm always looking for new retro prompts because I think that you can't have too many in your arsenal. Okay, so now let's talk quickly about tools for retroing in a virtual world. So obviously, as I've mentioned, everything to date, the retros that I've been discussing have typically been run in person. And you're up at a whiteboard, whether you're using stickies and Sharpies or you're just writing on the whiteboard. They're also, fun just because it's in-person meeting. Again, if there's drinks and snacks and music playing, it can be a really fun environment. But as we all know, there's little kind of in-person collaboration happening across the board right now, and we still need to be successful with these tools. So how do you retro in a virtual world? I have some recommendations. The first rule that I am adamant about is that you must not forget that fundamentally this is a team exercise. So if one person is remote, everyone should be remote. Obviously, with COVID, everyone was remote, but as people are starting to, some people are returning to office, some people are making the choice to stay remote. As people are starting to kind of have hybrid um, just work styles within a team, I would implore you to use this rule that if one person is remote, everybody should be remote. Luckily, we're about to talk about a tool that makes remote retros really easy, so it shouldn't be a very high barrier to entry. This also, I have been in these kinds of meetings where there has been one or two people that are remote and everyone else is in person, and it is a nightmare trying to like bring the camera up to the whiteboard so they can see the stickies. It never works out well. It's not a great experience for anyone involved. So this is kind of the golden rule. If one person is remote, we all are. So that being what it is I have this handy tool to recommend to you. This is a virtual retrospective tool. It's open source, so you can run it your self. I have an instance running. I just deployed it to Heroku. So I want to kind of show it to you in action a little bit. But I highly recommend that you use this tool because, like I said, it's free and available to you. And it's really handy little tool. It's not hard to get them running at all. So I'm going to switch screens. Great. Looks like that worked successfully. And here I have just, again, my running instance of, let me back up. I didn't do a proper introduction. This handy little tool that I have referenced is called Post Facto. It's created by the lovely folks at Pivotal before the VMware acquisition. And it really is just a great tool. So I have an instance of Post Facto running. What they have done is they have built kind of three columns for you. They're following the happy, I'm wondering about kind of meh format, which is fine. And what's nice about this is you can share this with your team. You can password protect it, which is really nice so that all the feedback stays nice and private to the important people that matter. And so you can do it one of two ways. Sometimes you can ask people, you can share the board and you can say, there's a lot we want to cover. Please go in and pre-populate the board with some of your feedback. Or again, if it's just kind of like a weekly retro, everyone gets into the board and can do kind of, again, 5 minutes of generation of, you know, I love retros, and everyone can go in and kind of add their comments. I pre-populated a couple of things on the board just for um, demonstration example purposes. But so you can go in and really kind of have people um, add to the various columns, which is great. And then when it comes time to discuss, before we get to the discussion, people can also go in and kind of upvote again other people's comments if they have an opinion, so it can accrue hearts, so it again can help you kind of guide what gets discussed first, maybe the top number of hearts, things like that. So that's a handy little feature. And then when it comes time to actually discuss, it has this handy little timer on it because you do, want to keep your retros moving along. You don't want to rat hole into one topic too much. And so this starts just automatically a 5-minute timer, which I find enormously helpful. When you're done discussing that item, you can say done. It kind of takes it out of we've discussed it, then you can go on to the next one, done, etc. The other handy thing that it has built into it, Moshe, I'm looking at you. This is per your comment, is it has an action items column built in. So, I'm lacking in creativity being put on the spot here, but send team memo. I don't know what that necessarily means, but you can add it to this action item and then it captures all of these action items here for you. You can then save this retro. It captures again that list of action items. So that's super helpful. You don't actually have to take a picture of the whiteboard. And that can also, again, be a handy way to um, just capture it, and then you can come back to it and you can actually check it off. So you can come back to this retro and say, here's all the action items that we captured. Here's how we're progressing on those action items. So it's a really handy tool, kind of has everything we've talked about so far of the nuts and bolts of how to run a successful retro. It has all that baked into it. So I think it's a great resource out there. So I would recommend that you use it. And I think that's all I wanted to show you with post facto. So I'm gonna pop back over. That's all I actually had in terms of content. There's a couple of questions that came into the chat. So if you have a question or a comment, this is your time. Put it in the chat. I'm going to look through what hasn't been covered yet and take some of these live. But in the event that you need to drop, thanks so much for attending. I really appreciate you taking the time to spend with me today to talk about retros. You should do them on your team. Okay, looking at the question. So, how to get everyone to at least participate if it's anonymous and you don't know who's posting? That's a great question. Um, Kevin, honestly, you you hope for the best. You hope that everyone participates. Um, maybe you kind of, if you're concerned about it, you can kind of maybe not do the silent generation yourself and see who is participating when people are writing on the stickies or things like that. Obviously, if you use post facto, you won't really be able to keep track of that. But again, you don't necessarily need every single person to participate in a retro. You just want the ones that have items that are important enough to them to write down, that you make sure that those issues are being surfaced. So if it's important enough, I guess you just have a little faith that those folks will write it down. And I think maybe if people don't have that faith initially, introducing retros and getting better at them will help give people the faith that this is a helpful tool, that they have something that they'd like to share, that they should. So kind of just starting, and the more vocal of the group, kind of greasing the wheels, so to speak. And then if you're diligent about being good about your action items, hopefully that will encourage participation from others in the future. Okay, Justin O'Connor mentions that acknowledging we are all different and share differently is an acknowledgement of our individuality and keeps the retro fresh, as well as improves trust. Totally, couldn't agree more with you, Justin. Um, so let's see, Kevin mentioned that feels like this is an easy feat. When we were in the office, going remote is where we started to notice less participation. I feel you. Um, we also lost our scrum masters as well, maybe just a lot of change. Obviously, this has been a heck of a year of dealing with change. We've all experienced that. I think, again, encouraging. So I guess the one thing I didn't mention is typically you run a post facto on something like Zoom or whatever your video conferencing platform of choice is. And so another thing is you don't necessarily need your Scrum Masters to run the retro. One of my recommendations, and kind of something I would encourage you to do, is to encourage the facilitation role to rotate throughout the team so that everyone gets a chance to do it. That you can totally still do with a remote tool like post facto, and there are other tools out there as well. I just happen to know and like post facto personally. A few more comments. Is the post retro action item is mandatory? Should it be for all the sprints? Not necessarily. I mean, if there's not a lot of actionable feedback, maybe people maybe did a really great job and people are like, wow, that went off without a hitch and I couldn't think of anything better we should do differently. And like, feedback is, again, one of those organic things that will come up. In the discussion, you want to kind of ask some different questions to get people to discuss further on the topics that are just listed on the board, and encourage them to really brainstorm. Is there something that we could do to improve or to be better at, et cetera, et cetera? And as those things come up, those naturally will reveal themselves as the action items. Do you discuss, look at previous Jira reports, and how did your team do this according to these, and how your team did according to those reports? Not necessarily. This is really not something like a progress report or status check-in. I think it's really, again, kind of a free form forum for folks to express organically and express their opinions. It's not necessarily like a status check. And I think that it's important that those two things be held in distinction. Now, if you are retroing, a sprint, and you're looking at your Jira board and it's like, we didn't accomplish everything on our Jira board, that's a piece of feedback, right? We didn't get through everything. There were leftover items, some things slipped. That is the feedback that you fundamentally want to talk about. But I wouldn't necessarily use the retro as, we only completed 9 out of 10 items. I would think those are more like stand-ups or weekly check-ins or things like that. How would you we get another question, how would you scale a retro of, 30 plus people retro, generate topics, divide topics, regroup? So Johan, that's a really great question. Large retros can be challenging. And I don't know if there is a, hard line number that it's like anything above 30 people, you shouldn't do it. I generally feel like the smaller the group, the better. But sometimes I have participated in large retros with 30 plus people. I think one suggestion that I would have if you're using something like post facto, asking people to kind of come already, really primed to talk about the issue is key. Maybe seeding the board with a couple of example topics or things that you're kind of like, I'm sure this is going to come up, to kind of help. You can either ask people themselves to pre-populate it, or you as the facilitator or the leader can pre-populate the board. Either way, but I think having maybe some, again, kind of seeds of inspiration, if you will, is helpful. And then grouping is going to be really helpful just with the discussion and kind of finding themes within all of the feedback. And that really is part of, or one aspect of being a good facilitator, is seeing all of these topics and kind of finding the conversation scenes, if you will, of where these things kind of belong, and then to discuss them topic by topic. I think that that would be a good strategy as well. A couple more here. How, if at all, do you integrate with your tracking tools such as Jira? We just kind of talked about this. Typically, I wouldn't recommend that retros do integrate with Jira, because I think that that should be really a separate meeting and a separate focus, and it's just a whole separate mind frame personally. Now, can you take the action items from your retro and have them exist in some, you know, logical place within Jira? Absolutely. But I wouldn't necessarily use the retro as a Jira review. Okay, I think that that is all of the topics that I see. So thank you all so much for joining today. I really, again, appreciate you taking the time to discuss with me. And I hope that you found this information useful, and I hope that you can take some of these tips and tricks to your teams. And don't be afraid of that feedback. It in general will help you become a better, just more successful and high performant team. So I believe in you. You can do it.
Nice, Cameron. Yeah, that was an awesome session, and you clearly have a lot of folks asking a lot of questions. Like, we've all been through really bad retros as well as really good ones, hopefully. And you definitely skilled me up on a whole bunch of aspects that I never really even considered when it comes to retros. Just like the fact of keeping variety in the format of it will actually keep the great feedback coming, and actually getting more value out of the meeting itself, rather than it turning into, okay, it's just the regular retro that we have every week. It's just a time suck on my calendar kind of thing. So I
Totally.
definitely appreciate that.
Of
Uh,
course.
a- and so, along with today's demo days, if you want to dig further into developer productivity, I suggest that you go to githubuniverse.com to check out our colleague Irini's session, "The Sustainable Future of Developer Productivity." We've got tons of content over there. It's all fresh and new and on demand. So check it out, dig further, and hopefully you had fun in this one. And we'll see you in the next one.